The land speed record was accessible for people. All you had to do was build something in your backyard. Find some edge of the envelope thing in human achievement right now that you can do in your backyard or a shed.
Here's a guy he will do whatever it takes. How many race drivers today will do whatever it takes? Maybe he was the first real race driver.
Okay, welcome to It's Not the Car. This is a podcast about racing for people who don't like podcasts about racing, but it's also for people who do like podcasts about racing. It's like Walt Whitman said, "We're large, we contain multitudes." I'm Sam Smith. I'm a journalist, and I sometimes spend my children's food money to go drive around in circles on a racetrack with other amateurs just like me. Jeff, who are you?
Hi, I'm Jeff Brown. I'm currently competition director at AWA. That means I do anything I can to try to make those IMSA Corvettes go faster and win races.
Cool. Ross.
And I'm Ross Bentley. I used to drive around in circles a lot, and sometimes some squiggly wiggly circles as well. Most of my time now is spent coaching other drivers and helping them drive around squiggly wiggly circuits as well.
You're eloquent too. I like it. So
Squiggly Wiggly. That's a
Squiggly Wiggly
grocery store in the Midwest, right?
Moving on.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we do a lot of different things here. We change the format every week because we have a lot of interests, and also we're easily distracted. But what we're about to do today is one of my favorite things we do. This is our monthly centerpiece episode. It's where I unpack a condensed story from racing's past, something from motorsport history that just absolutely blows my mind. And then we sit around and discuss it after and pull it apart even further. Now, sometimes Ross and Jeff have heard this story, sometimes they haven't, but the whole point is to find the human in it, see what yesterday has in common with today, talk about why we do what we do when we're chasing the things we love under pressure. And I say all this because today's piece is a little different. It's pretty far back, and we're going to try tackling it a little differently. Really let the story just breathe more. Most of the stories we tackle here have been fairly modern. This one is set way, 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 way back. It takes place in the 1920s. And if that sounds boring to you, well, I say, you sound boring. And you should turn this off now and go pick your nose in a corner or something. Because things that happened long ago are only boring if you think people were any different then. And here's the thing, they weren't. Doesn't matter what year it was. So, Ross, Jeff, are you game to start talking about this not in the way we do all the time?
Yes.
Squiggly? Wiggly.
What I really like about this is it's not 100 years old yet.
Right. I say it's old, but let's try something new.
Okay. All right.
Do it.
So all of this, so the way I usually do this is I drink a whole bunch of coffee and I just go ape and turn it up to Mach 2 and just do this as fast as I can. This one we're going slower. So if you want to hear it quicker, there's a button on your phone that'll make it go wee, and then you can hear me talk like a chipmunk. But today it's going to be like Sam, I don't know, stoned chipmunk maybe. So to begin, this all happens at a time when nobody in racing knew anything about anything, at least compared to now, right? This was when Formula One didn't exist, and the thing that came before it, what they called Grand Prix racing, was only around 20 years old. Qualifying speeds at Indy at this point had only crested 100 miles an hour a few years earlier. Most airplanes on this planet went slower than that. Most road cars could only do 50 or 60 miles an hour. The fastest might go 70 or 80. So, it's the 1920s. Cue the sound of 30 people running out the door because they're like, wah, ragtime music. But we have a man, an Englishman. His name was John Godfrey Parry-Thomas. He's Welsh. One of those names like addresses in England where somebody will live in, you'll address a letter to, I don't know, Rudy Toot House in Upper Yellow Licking, Brockmanshire, Pudding on River in Sussex. But Parry-Thomas wasn't what they called him. People called him Tommy. His family called him Godfrey. He was single. He had a bit of money. He was known for being a little distant and withdrawn. He was good with kids and animals. There are very few pictures that show him smiling. Now, part of this might have had to do with the fact that, like, his front teeth stuck out a little bit in a weird way, and he was, some people say he was kind but grumpy. We don't really know. But those same photos also show him in a lot of tweed and a lot of sweaters. He was an engineer, and he dressed like an engineer. period. He was born in 1884, and from day one, the guy had been interested in tech. He had studied electrical engineering as a young man. He worked as a government advisor during World War I. He founded a small company with his parents. He rose to become chief of engineering for an English car maker, truck company, just kind of, it's called Leyland. And if that sounds familiar, well, you're probably pretty damaged like me. And well, okay, Leyland, well, British Leyland, well, okay, MG, Triumph, Jaguar. Isn't that the company that owned all those brands and then flew them straight into the ground in the 1970s by making ungodly, stupid decisions? Yes, you're right. But that's not important right now. This was the 1920s. And the thing is, at this point in history, almost every single car company that would come to be powerful in the 20th century, they were small. Even GM. GM was eventually going to become the biggest company in the world, right? Biggest car company in the world. There for decades, they were tiny. Ford was struggling, trying to figure out how to evolve the Model T, which was still in production. And Henry Ford himself, he was still in power, but he was pretty old. And everybody looked at him and kind of, went, isn't that a weird old anti-Semite racist dude? And yeah, he was. Enzo Ferrari. Enzo was still driving race cars. That's how long ago this was. He was a driver for Alfa Romeo, hadn't yet formed his own team. He was still 2 decades away from building his own cars and starting his own company. Now, Parry-Thomas works for Leyland. Leyland got big making trucks. And one of the things that they got a bug up their keister to do was make things that weren't trucks. They kick off this luxury car called the Leyland 8. They build like 18 of them. Each of these things had a straight 8 up front that was around 7 liters in displacement. The fastest model you could buy, the fastest one of these things, out of 7 and like 0.2 or 0.3 liters, only made 146 horsepower, which if you think about what it takes to do that, like that's basically connecting rods as long as your arm and probably a few thousand RPM and no more. And all of it was torque from idle all the time, right? Things were just different at this point. Horsepower meant engine size. And I mean big, right? Like that's 7 liters. Grand Prix engines, stuff that the sport that evolved into Formula One, those things had good specific output, high power for their displacement. But in Grand Prix trim, that might mean like, you have a car going around Monaco, Bugatti is 1,400 horsepower. It's a 2 liter straight 8, makes 130 horse, 6,000 RPM, goes 150 miles an hour. And every 5 minutes you have to look at it, do something to it because the sport, every ounce of motorsport was evolving and it was still young. Bigger engines were known for moving things and the smaller engines were known for moving small things, but nothing did everything well. Now, Parry-Thomas, our Welsh boy, he loves this stuff, deeply, deeply enjoys going fast. And in England in the 1920s, there's one place to do that is better than all the others, faster even than Le Mans. Jeff, what do you know about Le Mans in the 1920s? And the answer, it can be okay if the answer is diddly squat.
Ooh, diddly squat.
Ross, you know anything about Le Mans in the 1920s?
It was in the 1920s.
Oh, cool. What do you think the average lap speeds were in the, like, let's say 25, 26, 24 hours of Le Mans?
Average lap speeds?
Yeah.
I'd guess 80.
Okay, Ross?
67.3.
Ross is really close. They didn't crest 60 miles an hour until 1926. That's the first year the average lap at Le Mans was more than 60 miles an hour. This is one of the faster racetracks in the world, right? Now remember, there's Le Mans, there's Indy. But if you wanted to go faster for longer and you didn't live on a desert lake or in a giant salt pan in someplace like Utah, you went to England. There was really only one place in England to do this. This was this track they built in 1906. It was the world's first purpose-built bank track. It was the largest and fastest in the world. It was called Brooklands. And like so many tracks that would come in England, I don't know, they built it around an airfield because you ever get the feeling that in England, you can't walk 5 feet without tripping over a castle and somebody who's got royal blood in them or an airfield? Well, you're right. That's most of England, right? Brooklands was 2.7 miles long. And think about that. How long is Indy?
2.5.
Right. So this is longer than Indy at a time when the cars were slowish, but also not that slow. So remember those GP cars, the Bugatti would do 150 miles an hour, right? Now, Brooklands was 2.7 miles long. It was shaped like a big teardrop. It was concrete. They used tens of thousands of tons of concrete to do it. It was in the outskirts, outside of London by today's standards, but in the boonies by that point. One end of the place was smaller than the other. It was a big kink in one of the straights, 2 straights. But here's the thing. It was banked. The banking was almost 30 feet high in places. It was banked at 30 degrees, which put that in perspective. What do you think the banking at Talladega is?
Isn't it 35?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like 33 or 34 or 35 or something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we've got basically, this is a speed bowl. This is a place you can go and go as fast as you want. And also maybe you die a little bit. Who cares? You go very, very quickly. Now, most of Brooklands is gone now. It's been torn down. There's a grocery. If you pull it up on Google Maps, there's a grocery and an Amazon warehouse and some houses, but there's also a museum and bits of banking. And if you're ever in England, you should go see it. I've always wanted to. I never have. But if you pull it up on satellite and Google Maps, you zoom in until you see cars and then you see the scale of the place. And then you think, and then none of it makes sense. You start zooming out and out and out and out and out until it looks like you're in space. And then you see the whole thing. It's big, right? So back to Parry-Thomas. On Easter Monday in 1922, dude's still working as an engineer at Leyland. He decides to enter a race at Brooklands in one of the cars he designed, one of those Leyland 8s, the big things, the stonky things. At the time, this was like one of the fastest and most expensive things in England. He does all right. He's not great. He lives, he survives the race. He didn't neither win nor lost. He was there. But it doesn't matter because he loves it. I don't know what that's like. Do you guys know what it's like to love racing?
Yeah, I do. It's
Yeah?
a disease.
Yeah,
It's an addiction. And did it get him?
No. He went home. He went home and he started writing books about mushrooms and he became a horticulturist. That's exactly what he did. He spent the rest of his life in a leather chair in fuzzy slippers. You laugh. No, it got him. Holy hell, it got him. Shit, man. It got him so bad he couldn't stop. He loves it so much. This is where I'm going to speed up. I don't care if anybody doesn't like it. He loves it so much he starts spending more time there. He gets so much into the place and racing and speed. Now remember, this dude, he is single. He has no spouse, no kids. He moves into the racetrack. He rents a cottage on the track grounds and he starts racing. He starts racing a lot. He starts winning a decent amount. He can't get enough. He goes faster and faster. He's good. He's quite good. He's among the best in England, just naturally talented. And it helps that he knows the cars inside and out, not just like Leyland's, but all of them. Like so many of the drivers of the era, he's just familiar with the machine. Because remember, context is everything here. This was a time when engines often needed teardowns and rebuilds between every weekend, sometimes at the track itself between races, when mechanical failures accounted for more than half of all DNFs in any race anywhere in the world. Even bearings, man. Like think of the last time you remember hearing about a bearing fail in a high quality engine. Like half of the problems came down to the fact that the spinny things in the bottom stopped spinning because the thing that let them spin went kaboom. Like bearing problems just don't happen anymore. I mean, unless you're talking about late model Porsches and IMS bearings, but it's fine. Those cars aren't built very well. It's okay. Nobody likes Porsches. So to give you an idea of just how old world these things were, those bearings weren't these replaceable metal shells pre-made that we use now. They were custom built for each engine by mixing and melting metals like a blacksmith in a pot over a fire and then pouring them into the engine, machining them in place. It was called Babbitt. It's metal. It's this whole other story. I could do an entire episode on Babbitt because I'm a giant dork. But fun side note. So the whole reason that people, for the longest time, until we developed a better answer for bearings, whole reason that people started using roller bearings. Like you look at the inside of a 1920s or 1930s Bugatti engine, it uses roller bearings for the crank and then uses roller bearings for the crank because they were more reliable than pouring that melty goo in there and then hoping it doesn't go boom, right? Even oil technology was in its infancy. Like this is a period where the best oil in the world was something called Castrol. And you've probably heard the name, but at the time it was actually made from, part of it was mineral, part of it was, organic, came from dinosaur bones, and the other part of it came from seeds of the castor bean plant because at really high RPM and high heat, it worked better than traditional oil and didn't come apart. And it also smelled amazing. You smell it, you can go to the historic races in England, you go to the Goodwood Revival, half the paddock smells like it. But that's a whole other story. Ross is making the face like, Sam needs to stop this. It doesn't matter. It can't be stopped. There's no stopping.
Oh, it smells great.
Oh, it smells
great.
So good.
Burn it in your go-kart motors, in your two-strokes.
God, what is it? Wait, they use it in two-stroke go-kart motors?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Still?
Oh, yeah. I don't know about still, but it burned. When I was a kid, we mixed it with our gas and we burned it in our go-kart motor. It smelled great. It smelled awesome.
I think we used to use it for barbecues.
It's amazing. It's like
it just smelled.
It's like you walk into like an oil derrick on fire crossed with a burning Whole Foods crossed with like, I don't know, grandmother's cooking steak. Like there's something rad in it that just smelled amazing. So okay,
and
so,
chocolate chip cookies.
chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it just smells like, freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. They smell so good. That's what the oil. Yeah.
I thought you were saying the oil smelled like it. Okay, so back to our boy, right? So Parry-Thomas. He's good at Brooklands. By the summer of 1922, he started racing this year, remember? By the summer of 22, he's been going so fast at Brooklands, making the car faster and faster, getting better as a driver. He just can't stop. His first race was Easter Monday of that year. By summer, the dude has landed 6 international speed records for the Leylands class and his first world speed record. 2 years later, by 1924, guy has every record in the class you could possibly get, including one where he went 114 miles an hour for 10 miles, which now, like if I want to do that, I can go out on the Golf that has the car seats for our kids in it and just sit there and just go, brrr, and it's boring. But here, it meant something, right? The press nicknames this dude Daredevil Thomas. I go do that in my Golf. They nickname me Toll in a Golf. Can we curse in this podcast? We probably shouldn't. They should just believe it. So I say they. Mike, I'm sorry. It's our producer, Mike. He's basically just long-suffering. He puts up with everything we do. So Parry-Thomas at this point, he decides for whatever reason that he needs to go faster. Now, at this point, the only way to go faster in the world and stay on the ground, it came down to 4 words. Ultimate land speed record. And in the 1920s, in England, that meant one place, really, and it sure as hell wasn't Brooklands. It was a beach in the south of Wales, which, if you're not familiar, is a country where they don't use vowels. They just stick Y anywhere they need to go. So you see a sign, it'll just be like, I love Welsh people. I love Wales. I love driving in Wales. All the car magazine roads in Wales are bonkers. But in Wales, they didn't do it on the public roads because, of course, they didn't. They did it on a long and fast and smooth and wide beach called Pendine Sands. Now, the thing is, we need to take a moment here because we are smack in the part of history where the automobile is rising to prominence. It is becoming the thing that dominates the world. It is getting cheaper and faster and more durable every year. And the land speed records are getting higher and higher. They're challenged and chased and poked at and made and all the time by people who built their own cars from scratch without always really knowing what they were doing and with little to nothing in the way of suspension or brakes and just massive, massive engines. Because remember, the only way we knew to make big power was to just have pistons the size of your leg. Road racing cars scaled up to just absurd heights, turned into missiles, basically. And the people who built these things, they were doing this sometimes in converted sheds or in literal backyards, right? So, Pendine. Jeff, I know we talked about this before, but what did you, initially, this is the rad thing. When I brought this story up, Jeff told me later that he was like, oh God, the 1920s. What did you think when we're talking about a dude that did land speed records on the beach? What was the first thing that came to mind with that, right?
First thing is I've done a couple studies. I've never actually got to do it, but I've done a couple studies about Bonneville. And one of the problems that you realize when you do an engineering study about Bonneville is the salt gets draggy.
Yeah.
It's got water in it. And the a large component of how fast you can go is how much drag the ground has. It's not hard like asphalt. And so I was thinking about the beach and I thought a beach, like a real beach, like sand, like water comes on it and stuff. That's got to be like, you ever try to pedal a bicycle on a beach? That's hard. I mean, how does this car go on sand? It didn't seem, I was like, I wouldn't pick that place. But I guess if you're stuck in Wales, where else are you going to pick?
And so you think about it, right? Because, everybody's knee jerk, if you're in America, which naturally all the world is, because that's where everything is based. God, man, sometimes you forget there's such this thing in this country where everybody's like, yeah, this stuff is happening. No, not everybody's knee jerk for sand racing is Daytona, but the knee jerk for people in this country, you think, okay, well, the Daytona right. 500, like it's rooted in racing on the beach, but that's Florida where things are, for the most part, unless the weather is terrible, it's great. And the sand is dry and hard packed and it is fast. Pendine was in a part of Wales, it's a part of England, part of the world where the weather every 5 minutes does something different. And usually that different is like, okay, pretty decent or gross. And it changed constantly, but it was still the fastest, longest, biggest thing they had. So record breaking at Pendine wasn't that old. First world speed record there was set by this English legend, this dude named Malcolm Campbell, Sir Malcolm Campbell, former like GP racer. He was a motorcycle racer. This dude was just like, he was what the British would call an absolute unit of a human, right? In September of 24, he sets the first world land speed record at Pendine. It's 146 miles an hour in a 350 horse Sunbeam. He calls the car the Bluebird. It's a big, big deal. Guy's in all the papers, like it makes the papers around the world. This is fast. A year later, in October of 25, our boy Parry-Thomas goes to Pendine. Try and check it out. Try to run. Weather is awful. It's just bad. Gets 3/4 throttle and 140 miles an hour. Can't hold the car, which we'll get to, any faster. Now, the following spring, in 1926, this is 4 years after he had started racing, remember? He goes back to Pendine. He's got a different car. It is a massive thing by modern standards, but not in many ways by the standards of the time. He'd been working on road racing cars. He'd been designing this stuff in workshops at Brooklands. Because remember, he still lives at the racetrack. Like the dream that I've had since I was 8 to live at a racetrack, dude did. Ross, you're making a face. Do you want to live at racetracks? I don't know. Do I? Yes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, how cool would that be? But, I think this is it. He definitely got the bug, right? And I'm thinking about a friend of mine told me a story about once selling his sofa to be able to go to another event. Sam, do you know who that could be?
Russ, that friend was me.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, it was me because I'm very stupid.
Yeah, but here's I think everybody in this sport has done some version of that, so I get it. But still,
and I'm guessing that his living at the racetrack and being right there was not like the people at Thermal that have their $5 million houses at the racetrack with their. It was not the same. Probably it was a little different for him, for Thomas.
I've half the reason I've wanted to see Brooklands is because some of the original buildings are still there, and you see pictures of them, and they look like little. The best word is brick outhouses, right? Like the stuff that they launched bombers from in the 40s, just weird little boxes of brick. But so he's living in Brooklands, and he's turned his whole life off. He's buried in this stuff. He cannot get enough of it, and he dug up a car. And the car that he modified in Brooklands and took to Pendine, we need to talk about this thing for a second, because this thing is a cannon. It is an absolute cannon of a thing. He had bought it. He didn't build it. He bought it and modified it. It came from the estate of a dead British man named, I'm going to get this name wrong, Count Louis Zabrowski. Now, this is one of those names that I've read for years, but never actually had to say out loud. But Zabrowski was a racing driver. He had built a series of specials, these giant straight line speed machines, all of which had monster engines. They were named Chitty Bang Bang, and that's a whole other episode because, yes, there was a movie called Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. It was Disney. It had Dick Van Dyke in it. And did Sam watch it like 4,000 times when he was little? Because they had songs and also Pretty Ladies and the car flew, and then they visited a candy factory at the end? Yes. Is that basically my version of the afterlife where everything is gravy? Yes. We don't need to tell that story right now. Anyway, Zabrowski drove race cars. Drove a Bugatti in the 1923 Indy 500. He died in a Grand Prix race in 1924 at Monza, driving on the Mercedes factory team. And when he died, they sold off all the stuff from his estate. That's where Parry-Thomas bought the car. One thing they bought was one of those Chitty Bang Bangs. It wasn't up to his standards. He was kind of embarrassed by it. It's big and crude, but it was the kind of thing that, anybody buys anything to go fast in that point, they screw with it. So he starts screwing with it, and it was fast. It was tall. It was narrow. It was nearly 23 feet long. It had a 27-liter Liberty engine. This is an American
2.7 liters. No?
Yeah.
27 liters.
2.7. 27 liters.
It's like a Carrera RS. It's a 911. Yeah.
I read that, and I went, typo. I found a typo. And I'm like, no, it's 27 liters. It's not 2.7. That's insane.
For years, the big fast car on the road was a 5-liter Mustang.
Yeah.
Well, you could more than 5 of those things.
5 liters. Yeah. So
And that thing came out of, you're probably going to explain this, but they didn't just build one. That came out of an airplane, some type of airplane, right?
no, it came out of airplanes. It came out of a lot of stuff. They used it in countless airplanes. It was in American stuff. It was in English stuff. It was in a couple of Fokkers at one point. It was built for World War I, right? And at this point in the mid-20s, it was war surplus, because the rad thing about a world war, and this is probably the only rad thing about a world war, but the rad thing about a world war is that at the end of it, you have all of this stuff hanging around that is just dirt cheap. Like, you know how after World War II, people bought P-51s and P-51 Mustangs, fighter planes, and drained the fuel in the tanks and then sold the fuel, and that paid for the airplane because the airplane was only like $200 or $400 or whatever it was. This, what do you got, Ross?
I'm sitting here going, I want to ask Jeff a question, because this is a very technical question. A 27-liter engine has to weigh a little bit of, it must be heavy. How do you get that thing to fly?
You have to make more power and lift. You have to make enough lift to lift the thing off the ground. I mean,
Wow.
I haven't seen the airplanes, but those airplanes got to have giant wings with huge, long wingspan, big cords. They got to be, and they can't go very fast because they just got to make a lift to get that big, heavy thing off. Can you imagine also, it's propeller driven. Can you imagine the reaction to the torque of the propeller on a 27-liter engine? I mean, I think I'm surprised the plane doesn't just flip around and the propeller stay where it is. I mean, holy smoke.
Yeah.
That's just, there's an engine in the Ford Museum, which is awesome to see. And it was one of the engines that was used, I think there was like 7 of them, to power the River Rouge plant back in the day.
Yeah.
And that thing has connecting rods that are 6 feet tall, and I don't know how many liters that thing is, but that reminded me of, when they said 27 liters, I'm trying to think, how do you get, the pistons must have been, and the stroke, I don't know how long the connecting rods were. They could have been, 18 inches long probably, and the pistons could have been, 18 inches in diameter. It must have been ridiculous.
I mean, the funny thing is, it was actually kind of compact. Because they also built it for use in tanks, right? Like they shoved these things in every
tank engine.
Yeah, right. So it was
once you got it moving. Whoa, look out!
It was one of the most, like, this was, so by World War II, we had in many ways gravitated toward round engines and more compact. Like all the V12s, the big long engines were relatively compact. But at this point, we still weren't sure what the best answer for this was. And this was for aviation engines was. And this was one of the most produced engines in history at that point. They'd made more than 15,000 of them in 1918 alone, and they were cheap. By the 20s, they were cheap and they were durable. They were just available everywhere, used for cars and records. Often it was like, what are you going to do today? I'm going to go get a McDonald's hamburger. Yes, I'm getting a hamburger. Okay, cool. Yeah, McDonald's is a place you go for a hamburger. What are you going to do today? I'm going to build a car. Oh yeah, what do you need? Well, I need a lot of engines. So you get the Liberty, right? Yeah, cool. We're going to set it in there. There are pictures of it on the internet in period with like Army Air Corps dudes standing next to it in like their jodhpurs and their weird little hats. And it's like a man standing next to a horse. So it made around 400 horse in stock trim before you tweaked it. And I mean, Parry-Thomas tweaked it because, he was the dude who lived at the racetrack. And also that was just what you did. So he buys this thing. He's busy with other stuff. He's building road race cars and all these other projects, but he buys it because it's a good way to get into land speed records just like that immediately. It's old at the time. It's seen as another era of thinking, but it's fast. The rear wheels, each one of the rear wheels is driven by a chain, and I mean an external chain. And I mean like, it's not just like this big shrouded thing, and it hangs out outside and you're not going to die if anything happens. No, it is a chain like on a bicycle and a giant sprocket, and you're in the cockpit, you can reach down and each hand can touch this, several feet of link that is putting all of that power into giant wheels, right? They sit outside, they're there. Parry-Thomas screws with the stuff. He screws with carburetors. screws with the pistons, screws with the clutch, changes the front axle to a Leyland one, changes the bodywork to make it more drag. He gives the car this long pointed tail, supposedly buys the car for a couple $100 and then spends like 800 or 900 pounds reportedly on it, which at the time, a new Rolls Royce cost 1,600 pounds. But everybody who was into land speed racing was like, man, he only spent like 800 pounds on that? Holy hell. Wasn't seen as much for a race car. Remember Campbell, Malcolm, the Bluebird guy? That guy probably spent more on shoelaces than Parry-Thomas had in this thing. And again, he just couldn't stop. And so when the new bodywork was done, he's at Brooklands and he's just like, oh, okay, well, all right. And he's excited. He's stoked. He takes it out on public roads around the house, doesn't have headlights, and he just rips around because that was who he was. Names the car Babs, and we don't really know why. Babs is short for Barbara in subcultures. Some people think it was because, one of the mechanics had written, one of his mechanic friends had written the word baby on the engine block and shock. Nobody really knows, but he takes the car to Pendine in April, takes it to that beach, April of 26. He sets a record the first day. The next day, he goes even faster. The sand is soft and wet. The conditions are way less than ideal, and the car is slow. But still, he whips, flogs, pushes, wrangles, wrestles the thing on that sand to 172 miles an hour. All told, in the end, he takes the land speed record from Campbell. Without Campbell's money, connections, this is a dude with a car who quit his job and started living at the racetrack. He beats Campbell's record by a whopping 18 miles an hour. And he goes home and he's like, all right, well, okay, going to do Parry-Thomas things. It's the winter. That winter at home, he changes the car again. He starts screwing with it again because of course he does. He adds wheel fairings and a few other touches. And then almost a year after setting that first record, in February of 1927, he goes back to Pendine. And he averages, in February of 27, Campbell goes to Pendine. And he averages 174 miles an hour, takes the record from Parry-Thomas. And Parry-Thomas is itchy. Like, he gets another bug up his keister. It's February. Parry-Thomas goes back in March, a month later, almost on no notice. The beach is wet, it's windy, it's not in any condition for this sort of thing. On top of it, the guy has the flu. He is 41 years old. He is sick. But he feels like he has to do this, and he feels like he has to do it now. He's worried about Campbell and Campbell coming back and stealing the record again, but also he knows at the time there are Americans going after the record, and the Americans had been building bigger and bigger engines, and Indianapolis is helping, and development is like cruising along in a way that it just simply isn't in Europe, where smaller engines are more the focus, right? Campbell knows this too, but Parry-Thomas in particular knows this, and he feels the pressure because he doesn't have any money. He knows it's a matter of time before they just can't compete anymore. So they're there. The weather's awful. They're sitting on the beach. There's a hotel near the beach that they sit in for 3 days waiting for the weather to clear. It finally gets a little better. He's still got the flu. He lies to reporters. He tells them he feels better. He doesn't feel better. At 12:30 in the afternoon, they roll the car onto the beach. There are journalists and officials. And the car it's not great. It's smoking. He makes a run. It's too slow. Goes back to the garage and tweaks it. Starts poking at it. They poke at the carbs. They change plugs. 20 minutes later, they're back on the beach. Now, land speed records are made by averaging 2 runs. One run in one direction, one run in another direction, counts for wind, counts for error, counts for, you did this once, can you do it again? Like, sure, it just wasn't a one-off, fancy boy. So the first of those 2 runs, he averages more than 186 miles an hour, which is, remember, the last run was in the low 170s. The second run in the opposite direction is similar. And then in front of all those people, in front of all of his friends, in front of the people who had helped him build the car, in front of the journalists, officials there to watch, the car starts to slide. It leaves the path it's on and slides across the beach. It rolls. It's upside down. It loses a wheel. It comes back right side up onto the 3 wheels that are left. It is turned and facing the sea, and it comes to a stop and catches fire, and black smoke is pouring off of it. 2 of Parry-Thomas's friends get to the car first, and he is hanging halfway out of the car. There is clear head trauma from what appears to be damage from a drive chain. There's gore everywhere. He's clearly no longer with us. He was killed instantly. His friends reach into the fire and try to free him. They can't get him out of the car. They end up having to break his legs to pull him free. And as the car burns, they carry him across the beach and set him down under a jacket and cover him with their clothes. Now, there are a few theories on what happened. Evidence is pretty slim, but the most prominent one comes from the damage to the car, comes from the injuries Parry-Thomas got, comes from the blood that's on the car. Forgive the explicit nature of that line, but forensics are forensics. Basically, the most prominent theory suggests that a spoke on the right rear wheel broke, and then more spokes broke after that, and bits of the wheel got caught in the right chain's drive sprocket. And then the right rear wheel began to come apart. And there's some suggestion, we don't know for sure, nobody saw it, that at that point, Parry-Thomas looks out of the car, and then the thinking goes, the chain broke. And the chain came up to where he was, and then the car began to yaw and tip. No, that was it. He was buried in Byfleet Church, which is about a mile from Brooklands. It's still there, because of course it's still there. It's England. Everything's still there. His death made the national papers. It even made papers in America. This is a time when land speed records were as important as the moon landing was in its day, right? This was a big, big deal. And on the beach, Thomas's friends were upset. I mean, how could they not be, right? They decide the car should never run again for a bunch of different reasons. They talked about throwing it into the sea, but in the end, they ended up digging a grave for it on the beach. It was about 7 feet deep, and they pushed the car into the beach with a tractor. And there are photos on the wire services, you can Google it, of the thing after the accident, and it was an ember, right? Now, to discourage souvenir hunters, friends spread the rumor that the car had been busted up with sledgehammers, that Parry-Thomas's jacket was still in there and it had been cut to ribbons. There was nothing left to take. But that wasn't true. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. And the car sat there, buried on the beach for decades. In later years, the British government came to own the piece of land that the car was buried on. They actually built a police station over it. And this is where it gets a strange coda, because in 1969, a Welshman named Owen Wyn Owen, an engineering professor at a college in Wales, he wonders if the car should be pulled out and exhibited to help tell the story and to shine a light on the man and what he did. And keep in mind that, for the longest time, he wasn't a national hero, but he was close. He was one of those people that you could become a household name by driving a car on a beach that you built as fast as it would go. And so Owen Wyn Owen, in the late 60s, he spends more than a year of paperwork, and he gets permission. And in this moment that is extremely controversial at the time, it has since become, well, not. But it's very controversial. They tunnel down through the floor of the police station. They bust through 9 inches of concrete. They shovel away the sand, and they find the car sitting there intact. It is Babs. It is buried in the sand. It has only one wheel, and the engine block is cracked. But the rest of the thing is remarkably okay. More than 40 years later, even the tire that is on that remaining wheel, it's a Dunlop, that tire held air. And today, Babs is restored and alive, and she is regularly run and exhibited at places like Goodwood. She's driven by Owen's son. There's footage on YouTube. There's footage on the BBC, all of it. But you can see footage of her running, and the engine does what a Liberty does, which is spit little tongues of flame out the short stacks on each cylinder because it's a Liberty. But she's on display in England every summer at a small museum in Pendine, where they have not held land speed records since. I didn't know this, guys. I had no idea until I started looking, because I've known this story since I was little. I stumbled onto it in a Ken Purdy book. And we can talk about Ken Purdy some other day, but Ken Purdy is amazing. But I read the story when I was little, and I didn't realize they were running land speed records on Pendine in some form or fashion until the year 2002, which is just its own thing, right? But the real footnote to this is Parry-Thomas's gravestone, which for some reason just gets me. It hits me in my spleen. There is this aching core of heart and emotion and everything that mattered about what the guy was doing and what it meant to people at the time wrapped up in this. It was written by his friends who had, remember, watched him die on that beach next to the Irish Sea. And it says, the tombstone says, life is eternal and love is immortal, and death, which is only the horizon, is nothing save the limit of our sight. And I get chills sometimes reading those words because nobody hops into an IMSA car and thinks like that. They don't think about having that on their tombstone if they screw up. One of the great parts of living in the modern world is that they don't have to. But the other side of that coin is that those words wouldn't mean anything if they said them because the world is just too different. We love racing for what it does for us, and we so rarely have to think about what it can take away. And I can't imagine a world where we had no idea what the machine was capable of, where that changed every year, and we only knew that it was good and getting better, and half of society looked at it as one of the most romantic and wonderful things we could do, and the other looked at it as this terrible and stupid thing that killed people literally every day and wasn't going to go anywhere or produce anything worthwhile. And the thing is, the people who believed, well, it just meant something different to them, and they were willing to risk everything for that belief, knowing that it was probably, not possibly, not maybe, but that if they did it long enough, it was going to take everything away. But the reason at the bottom is the same as the reason we do it now, the same as any of us, because they felt alive, right?
Yep.
I don't.
So, Sam, I'm conflicted here.
Yeah.
There's a side of me that looks at him and what those drivers and those people back then, what they did, and I just went, that is totally, totally insane. Like,
Yeah.
What would make somebody do that? And then I flip it around and go, but if it was the same amount of risk today, we'd still be doing it. And, you know, that's, like you said, it's what makes us alive. So, yeah, I'm conflicted because I kind of go, I can't understand why they do it. And on the flip side, I go, I can totally 100% understand it because I would do the exact same thing.
Right.
I see where that conflicted thing comes from. To me, I think what you have to do is it was a different era. It was a different mindset. And I was like you, Ross. I was like, holy smokes, that nobody does that nowadays. Nobody goes to that level of commitment nowadays. And then I thought, well, actually, I'm a big fan of the space program and the sound barrier breaking and all of that kind of era of engineering. To me, it relates similar to that. We were pushing the boundaries of understanding of physics and vehicle dynamics and aerodynamics and things like that in the space era. When when we were trying to break the sound barrier, that was a scary thing. We didn't know. We just did not know what the next step was. The same way for Thomas. He didn't know if you go 180 with the tire come apart? Would the chain break? Would the thing sink into the sand? He didn't know, but yet he did it anyway. And he risked his life to do that into the unknown. Nowadays, I think I tried to relate this story at first to modern racing. Oh, okay, well, they're racing and they're doing the same thing we do every week, just with different equipment. I think it was way different. The whole mindset was way different. They were not just racing to compete in a sport to beat the next guy. They were pushing the boundaries of known human experience of what a machine like that could do and willing to risk their life.
But Jeff, do you not think that whatever it is, 94 years from now, somebody's going to look back at what we're doing today and think the exact same thing?
I would think you'd have to,
or maybe even 9.4 years from now,
right? Because
I mean, the same math in with the engine capacity. So yeah,
right. Well, I mean, we look at because we even look back to when racing was more a sport and not a death-defying thing. Well, I mean, it was kind of the borderline, but we look back at a 1970s Can-Am car and go, no way. I mean, that was ridiculous. And this is just that times 10.
So two things come to mind. I can remember some of the most competitive, crazy, fun racing I ever did was when I was racing Formula Ford, drafting in packs and wheel to wheel, and the lead change would change 5 times per lap, right? And I can remember racing that for a couple of years and winning a lot of races, and then like 3 years later going and watching a Formula Ford race and going, those guys are crazy. I would never do that. But you did it. And, so there's that. There was a time when I didn't wear a head and neck restraint. And that was normal. We were talking beforehand. There was a time that I didn't wear ear protection. You didn't wear ear protection driving a go-kart.
Right.
Like, we didn't know any different, so we just did it. And now, like, if I get into a car and I'm not wearing a Hans device, I feel naked.
Feel weird, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, some of it is just we didn't know any better and they didn't know any better.
But
So
I mean,
is it really any different than where we are today?
I think I don't know so much. I don't know so much how to pull it apart, other than to say it's neither better nor worse, just different, right? And it's not that not knowing any better or knowing any worse is the crux of it. For me at least, what gets me is like, so remember too. So we were a handful of years past what they believed was the greatest war the world would ever see, right? It was only a few years in the rear view. And everybody thought that sacrifice and the pain that came out of that, just endless, like feeding humans into a meat grinder over and over again. Like most of France was a big pile of mud where if you stuck your head out of a trench, it would get lopped off by a machine gun, right? And they believed that was so awful that we would never let it happen again. Well, it's like, yeah, that's great. It unfortunately happened again. But that, you look at that and you look at what happened in the years after World War II, where sports car racing and open wheel racing got massively, massively faster. And it took a couple of decades for people to really react to the risk and how it needed to change, right? Like the big Jackie Stewart safety campaign wasn't until Stewart's career was really rolling. And that was mid to late 70s, right? Mid 70s. But you look at that, I mean, so much of what gets me is that it is both the same and different in the sense that they weren't just drawing on a piece of paper. They were inventing the paper, inventing the pen, and then inventing how to look at a 3-dimensional object in 2 dimensions, right? Everything they did. Can you imagine how the land speed record was accessible for people? All you had to do was build something in your backyard. Find some edge of the envelope thing in human achievement right now that you can do in your backyard or a shed. I don't know what it is. Maybe it doesn't exist.
Well, I know I have not been to Bonneville for the world land speed record, all the speed record stuff. I've not been there, but I know a couple of people that go regularly, and I know a guy who has one of the records, and it is very much like that still. It's a bunch of hot rodders, and they're just building stuff. And It's crazy. And so as much as like, there's a side of me that wants to look at that, what Parry-Thomas did and all those, what happened then, and just go, wow, that was really different. But I don't think it was. Like,
Well-
and even you're talking about him moving into the track. Here's a guy he would do whatever it takes. How many race drivers today will do whatever it takes? Just about all of them. I'm going to say all of them that make it have done some level of that.
Fair.
Some of them have sold their sofas and then I got another sofa, so they sold it again, another one, because they get to the next, like, whatever it takes. And that's where I go, like, I don't know about Campbell. I don't know about Seagrave and, some of the other drivers of that time. But to me, the part that got me was John Parry-Thomas maybe he was the first real race driver.
Oh, I don't know.
He wasn't.
Come on, Ross.
Well, no, maybe, a lot of the drivers at the time were wealthy
Aristocrats.
Yeah. And hey, I'm going to slight tangent, and somebody's going to get mad at this. Lance Stroll
Okay.
in Formula One
Okay.
got all the money in the world. He works his butt off to be there. Okay.
Yep.
Deserves to be there because of that. Okay.
Yep.
But he didn't have to work hard. He didn't have to move into a house in the middle of the track and buy a car for 200 pounds and start tinkering away at it. Right. But there are drivers on the Formula One grid, on the IndyCar grid today, who have done the same kind of thing. And so I don't know the history well enough to know whether Parry-Thomas was the first guy that sacrificed as much as he did to make it and do what he did. And that I go, yes,
That's cool.
He's a race driver.
I would take it to the extent of, I agree, he's a race car driver, but I got a feeling that he never sat there and went, oh, I'm doing something that's just unbelievable and nobody else is doing this and all that. Right. To me, he was like, I again would say more like an explorer. Humans want to do stuff that's never been done before. We want to go to the moon. We want to go faster in an airplane. We want to, discover the West. So we get in a canoe and we canoe with some buddies and an Indian girl and we figure that out.
I was going to say the verb is Sacagawea. We Sacagawea to the west. Right.
We and that's all he was doing, right? He was exploring the boundaries of physics and humans. And
so what separates him from Elio Castroneves, who wants to be the first 5-time winner of the Indy 500?
Yeah, probably not much.
Okay.
Probably not much.
So this is really interesting, right? So think about it. So you made the point that people are still going to Bonneville. And I was thinking about this. It's like, okay, they're setting land speed records. All right. But they're not setting ultimate as absolute fast as possible as we could go, right? At that point, 180 miles an hour was about as fast. No one had been faster on wheels. The current absolute land speed record is somewhere, it was Thrust SSC, the jet-powered, the one that had 2 giant turbines hanging off the side of it, the project that keeps getting off the ground and then falling apart and then getting off the ground again. They have to go run on, I think it's the Hakskeen Pan in Africa. But so that project is currently somewhere around, or the last time they ran it, I think it was like 750, 760 miles an hour, 760 miles an hour, right?
Right. They broke the sound barrier, right?
Yeah.
But it was not wheel driven.
Right.
The wheel driven one would be equivalent to Parry-Thomas's because his was wheel driven.
So I honestly don't know. What is the wheel driven land speed record at this point? Do we know?
We'll probably do some research, but I
will do some research while you guys talk.
Okay. So I have a friend, Roger Schroer, who has driven, he's done over 400 at Bonneville.
Wow.
In a first of all, a hydrogen powered car. So basically he drove a hydrogen bomb 400 miles an hour, just launched himself. Right. Okay. And then this is the Ohio University, the Buckeye Bullet.
Okay.
And now it's converted to an electric. So he has now the world record for electric vehicles, and they're wheel driven.
Okay.
So and that is the fastest you can go now in that class, wheel-driven vehicle. And maybe, Sam, are you going to the point where it's like there were no rules and now there are some?
No, I guess it's more, and I don't in any, believe me, I know in no way and am trying to take what you're saying and pull it apart. It's more just,
Oh, yes, you are.
no, I am. That's because I can't stand you. No, but the thing, I guess, that I'm not, what I don't want to do here is sit here and point backward and go, look, things are better, or point forward and go, look, things are better. It's just different. And you think about then only, I feel like it's worth thinking about then only in as much as it tells us something about who we are and where we're going and why we do what we do now. And what I find so compelling is that at a bare minimum, they didn't know much beyond what the thing could take from them. And every driver who straps into a car at Indy knows they might not get out. They know the chances are very, very slim. But the fact that they do that is rad, right? And there's, I find it remarkable to think about, bravery and risk are only relevant, they only are compelling in context. What you're willing to give up in exchange for the chance to do X or Y or Z. And it's remarkable how we've made, and I think this is a wonderful thing, and this is exactly as it is and should be, we've made motorsport a relatively safe endeavor. And the fact that only took 100 years is remarkable, like just astonishing, It's deeply cool.
And Sam, I'm not saying that what happened then was better or worse. And obviously there are differences. We don't run 27-liter engines anymore.
Right.
Well, how cool would that be? So there are different, but I think to me, at the core of the thing, he was a racer and he was willing to take risks. And Elio Castroneves at the Indy 500, he's willing to take risks to be the first 5-time winner. And whoever just broke the land speed record at Bonneville or wherever it is now, or Lewis Hamilton trying to win the 8th world championship. I mean, there are big risks involved there. So here's my question though, is in the 20s, obviously everybody knew there were risks and you knew that it could happen, right? But because racing there weren't as many people doing it, I don't know how many people died in a year. But think about it going into the 50s and 60s and into the 70s when there'd be like half a dozen drivers every single year in the major top levels that were dying. Maybe they were crazier than they were in the 20s.
Yeah.
Because it was like, it was happening everywhere. You just went, there's my friend, he just died. There's my other friend, he just died. I'm going racing now.
Right. What was it? The statistic is somewhere like between 1966 and 69 or something, the F1 grid lost like a driver a month or something, averaged out. It was something absurd like that.
Every third driver was going to die or something like this.
And that's a really good point, right? Because we think about it relative to, in the 1920s, literally, the old joke is that in the old days, literally everything would kill you, right? But in the 1920s, people did not wear helmets on motorcycles. People barely wore helmets in airplanes. Things burned down on the regular, like people were still living in houses coated in lead paint and getting sick from it constantly. Like everything happened. And, to your point, by 50 years later, motor racing was still just about as deadly as it had ever been. The rest of the world just got safer, which is kind of amazing that it stood there, right?
And exactly. And I bet now I'm being maybe not swayed, but I'm agreeing with both of you guys.
What? Jeff just agreed? You heard that, right?
We're supposed to disagree. I'm trying to find reasons to disagree. But
I have never, even the episode where we tried to get you guys to disagree, it didn't work. You just don't. You just think the same. It's great.
Right. Well, you have a good point of view. I said, they're explorers and they're trying to do something nobody else has done before. Well, I guess when you're out qualifying at your local whatever Miata race, and you're trying to break the lap record for Miata, you're trying to do something nobody's ever done before too. Yeah. So is he any different? Is that guy any different than Paul Thomas? Oh, and 503 miles an hour is the answer to the wheel driven. And it was done with a car that had a 5,000 horsepower all-wheel drive gas turbine engine powering all four wheels.
Wow,
Yeah.
man. So
Yeah, that's a four-wheel drive thing, I think, is the thing at Bonneville because of the traction thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and this is somebody who's going to find that there's a more current one, but my quick search here, it was done in 2018. Gas turbine.
Man.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So
it was 30, top speed of the machine measures 36 feet. Yeah, it's 36 feet long, which is longer than the Babs, right?
Yeah.
Babs was, what did you say?
What did I say?
23 or something?
Yeah. So we're unfortunately almost out of time, but when we were emailing back and forth about this before we taped this show, I wrote down some questions, and forgive me, because I want to I think they're deeply relevant to close on, just because it's all the stuff that doesn't have an answer, right? But it's all the stuff that we talked about before we taped this the stuff we've been orbiting. And if you guys are okay with it, I just want to run through it. So we've all had these moments that make us think in the car, right? Like, A, what do you think he was thinking? How much do you think he knew or didn't? What do you think he taught himself at the wheel or under the car with a wrench? And the question is, could you, could Ross, could Jeff, could anybody listening, could you do what he did with what you know now? Like Ross's point, what if you didn't know any better? What if the 1920s were all you knew? And could you imagine doing what you did in a car the size of a house with cart suspension on an uneven and wet, lumpy surface? Can you imagine the friends who would support you doing that, knowing that they might lose you at any minute? Can you imagine how angry or broken apart they must have felt? What the depth of emotion that must have compelled them to bury the car? Like, all of that stuff. I don't have answers for any of that. Do you guys? I mean, I don't know.
The first thing that comes to mind, Sam, is when I've coached a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old that are like, they're committed to going, they want to be Formula One, IndyCar champions, whatever, right? They want to win Le Mans. That's what they want to be. What makes them, the single thing that makes them fast is being naive. They don't know any better. They will do things and get away with it because they did it. You take a driver that's 30 years old or 40 years old or 50-year-old, you throw them in the car, they know that bad things can happen, and that stops them. How old was Parry-Thomas when he did this? He was like 40, wasn't he?
He was in his early 40s. Yeah.
So first of all, I think there's certainly value. I don't know if value is the right word there, but there's value in being naive, in not knowing things, because when you don't know things, you try things.
I agree, but you asked Sam if I would do that. No, but I've worked with race car drivers. One of them's on this podcast.
He's grinning. He's just saying this. One
of them's on the podcast who are so committed to achieving a goal, and the goals can be various. It can be, we got Parry-Thomas trying to break the world land speed record on a wet beach with a airplane engine in his car. But we got other guys trying to get the pole, trying to get a better stint average for that stint than anybody else, trying to do that kind of stuff. And I've seen drivers, and Ross is one of them, committed so much that nothing really else even enters their mind. They've blocked out all the distractions, all the things, and all they want to do is that. And they will spend every waking moment, every dollar, every irrationally do stupid things to achieve that. And it seems like that's what I've worked with guys. So you said, could I see people doing that? Heck yeah, I see it like almost every weekend.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting point, right? Because ultimately, the core of all of this is just, hey, we can do a thing. What if we do it more? Like, what if this is as best we've got? What if we have more best? What if we try harder? And I love that. I love the notion of figuring out where the edge is and then going, well, what if it's a little further beyond? What if we poke it?
Because recently there was the 30th anniversary of Ayrton Senna being killed, right? And I read an article where after, the day before he was killed, Roland Ratzenberger was killed. And there was, well, at the time, Sid Watkins was the doctor in Formula One, and he was very close to Senna. And I read this article about Watkins, and Watkins trying to convince Senna, stop now. And Senna just went, I can't. I've got things to do. And I think those aren't his exact words, but that's kind of the takeaway from it is I still have more to do here. And I think that people like Parry-Thomas, that's the way they think, is I got things to do.
It's, we make all fun of it, racing. Yeah, you're racing, you're spending all your money, you're spending all your time. It's an addiction. It's maybe not so far off. It might really be.
Yep.
Gambling, there's a lot of similarities between gamblers and alcoholics and racers.
Well, that's probably the best note we could come up with to close it. On that note, thanks for sticking with us. That's our show. Our topic next week will be, what is our topic next week, guys? Do we know our topic next week? Our topic next week will be, okay, yeah. It was a time that Ross was working at a race shop in Canada, and he had this, there was a cute little dog, and everything was black and white and kind of dull. And then the storm came up, and the weekend, I don't know, went rain delay, but not before Ross was transported off. He was just kind of taken off in the air, kind of flying, but not really. I don't know, there were probably wings and gurney flaps involved, off to this magical land called America. And a house fell on Tony George right as Ross met this scarecrow, and Jeff was made of metal, and people, who didn't know him, they thought he was cold and unfeeling because he's, this engineer stereotype, but he had a heart all along. And then they followed this brick road, except the road was really a racetrack. You might even call it a yard of bricks, brick yard, whatever you want to call it. And at the end, they met this guy named Roger, Captain Roger, RP, who told them that they could have always gotten to the speedway by just, clicking their heels together. And that even, the big secret is that even he too was rooting for Pato O'Ward to win the whole thing. He just didn't want to admit it. Yeah. So It's Not the Car is produced by us. The one and only Mike Perlman is our executive producer, and he also owns BMW 2002, which makes him a great person, and I won't hear any different. I'm the show's creator. For more on bonus content and perks and any events we can do in the future, you can subscribe to our free news feed at patreon.com/Not the Car. The option for that is in the 3 little dots in the upper right corner of the screen. If you like this episode and you'd like to support what we do here, check out the same link and click Become a Member. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with 2 or 3 or really just 10,000 people who might enjoy it. Your recommendations help keep us on the air, and they make a huge difference. As always, thank you for listening.
Have fun.
Keep having things to do.